Awesome. Thanks, Saroj. And thanks to you and Jonathan for inviting me here. It's really cool to join in a new community. It's my first time in this group, and yeah, really excited to share a talk. So let's get going. So yes, I'm Tim. I'm super excited to be here today. I live in Canberra in Australia, where I work at BuildKite. If you haven't heard of us, we make a fast and flexible CI/CD system for all kinds of developers. And we do all of that with Ruby, which is pretty cool. In the open source world, I work on a few things, the Hanami, DryRB, and RomRB projects. And we'll be spending our time with at least one of these today. I think you can probably guess. And yes, just to say again, excited to be here and speaking with the Nepalese Ruby community. Thanks again, Jonathan and Saroj, for arranging this. I haven't been to Nepal myself, but one day I hope to visit. But in the meantime, even from my home in Canberra, I do have a few regular reminders of Nepal. Firstly, like this, the black Kathmandu puffer jacket, which is like the official uniform of Canberra when the weather gets cold. So yeah, that's one little reminder. But more seriously, I did learn this cool fact when I was looking around recently, that in the last 10 years, the population of Nepal-born residents here in Canberra has increased nearly 100 times. So they're now a full 1% of the population, which is really awesome. And Nepali is the third most spoken language in Canberra at home after English and Mandarin. And in fact, just last month, a new Nepalese restaurant opened in my neighborhood. So yeah, hope to check it out soon. So yeah, I had a bit of fun doing research to kick off this talk, but I learned one more really interesting fact, and this is especially pertinent given it's January now. It's the new year. This is the first RubyNepal Meetup of 2023, and it's that in Nepal you have not just one New Year's celebrations, but like 5 or more different months, different communities. This is a really cool discovery, and great timing for me with this talk because I did want to kick it off by talking a little bit about New Year's resolutions. You might know what these are. The whole idea that when we pass from one part of the calendar to the next, some people might want to take stock of what they've achieved in the last year and think about how they might want to do better in the next year. And some might make fun of the idea about an arbitrary date change, trying to conjure in differences in our behaviors and habits, but I'm all for it. If a new year can help you change your habits, then that's a really powerful idea. New year, new you. Now, this is a Ruby meetup, so I'm not going to make suggestions about exercise or any of those sorts of things. But as you can imagine, I might suggest that we can resolve to try a new approach to building our Ruby apps. So this is the talk, Hanami 2, new framework, new you, and I'm glad to be sharing this with various people because Hanami 2 was actually released just at the end of last year, so it's really new. And I'm excited for all the possibilities that it might unlock, both in the shape of Ruby apps in general, but also for each of us as Ruby developers. So how do we get here to 2.0? Well, it started in 2014. Back then, Hanami saw its first release, and it labeled itself as a simple, fast, and lightweight web framework with a strong focus on maintainability and testability. And just a year later, another effort sprung up in the DryRB project. And this is where I was working. And our aim with DryRB was to help Rubyists write more maintainable app code in various ways. Now, some years passed, and in 2018, we all realized, both the Hanami and the DryRB groups, that we were traveling in the same direction. So we decided to join together and work on Hanami 2 as one big group. And after a busy 4 years later, we have finally made it. 2.0 is out. It's a faster, better, stronger, more flexible framework. It combines all the power and flexibility that you might get with DryRB with a friendly and streamlined out-of-the-box experience. Now, it was a true team effort, so I do want to share a shout out to these legends here, particularly to Luca and Peter, my teammates on the core team. Everyone put in a huge amount of work to get to where we are. Now, if learning Hanami is our New Year's resolution, we need a plan to get where we want to go. So here is our plan for the next 20 minutes. We'll start by building something because that's how we can truly get to know the framework. Then we'll learn what else the framework can do for us once we're familiar with it. And lastly, we'll see how that can help us grow and to think about Ruby in a new light. So now we know what Hanami is and where it came from. Let's start building with it. This is how we'll get a real feel for it. So we'll start by installing Hanami, and then we'll run Hanami new to create a new app. And today we'll call this one Bookshelf. And then we'll start off by checking the app class itself. This is nice and simple. We won't need to spend too long here. But I do want to point out one thing at this point, and it's that all app code in Hanami lives inside a single namespace, which matches the app's namespace. So here we have module Bookshelf. This is that all the code in our app will live within. So let's move over to the routes. In a fresh Hanami app, we get a simple welcome string as our default route. But to make our app real, we'll need to do something more than this. We want to generate an action. And we have a friendly generator we can run. So here we'll make an action for our books index. And this generator made a new route for us. And this looks pretty straightforward. We want a get requests to the books URL to go to our books index action. Let's go check it out. And here's the action that our generator made. And this is a basic starter action. Now, actions in Hanami are the things that are responsible for all of our HTTP interactions. And we have exactly one action for each endpoint in our app. And the handle method here is the most important part of every action because this is where we tell it how to behave. And here we can see we're given separate request and response objects. And we can use these objects to do things like inspect the request parameters or set the response body. Now, speaking of request parameters, actions support flexible param validation schemas. This helps ensure the params meet all our expectations, both in terms of their structure and their types. So here in our index, because this is an index action, we'll want a couple of optional params. Firstly, a page number and then a per page value. And we want both of these to be integers and we want both of these to be greater than 0 as well. And with that, we can now return an error response if those params are not valid. So we can see here that actions provide many helpful features for handling different aspects of HTTP interaction. But where do we want to put our business logic? How can we go about and fetch the books for our index? And to do this, we can get to know one of Hanami's most important features. And that is in Hanami, our app is also a container. And a container here works as a central organizing object that's responsible for loading and managing access to all the components in our app. Our action is already a component. We can fetch it from the app like this, using a key that matches its name. And what we get back is an instance of that action ready for us to use. In fact, any class that we put into the app directory will be made available to us as a component. So in our case here, let's make a component for a book repo, which can return a list of books for our actions. And it could look something like this. And since this class is in the app repos directory, we'll give it a matching namespace inside Bookshelf. Then we can add a method to return some of the latest books that we've read. Now, this is a stand-in, of course, something that connects to a real data source, but for our little demo, it'll do. So now we have two components. We have our action and we have our repo. But how do we get the two components to know about each other? What we really want is to use that repo from inside our action. And for this, we can use Hanami's deps mixin. We can include this mixin, inside any class in a Hanami app. And pass in a list of components that we want to have as dependencies. So deps, short for dependencies. And those components become available as instance methods inside that class that we can use wherever we need. And using deps like this is central to how we can create high-level behavior by bringing together smaller, focused components. And in this case, we're using those latest books from our book repo to create a JSON response for our action. Now, after all of that, we can run our Hanami server and see that it works. Here's our list of books. So we've made our first working feature with Hanami. So far, so good. It's helped us get to know the core of the framework, and it's put us in a great position to go and learn more features. And we can start by looking at the testing experience. How can we test this action that we've just created? Well, like every part of Hanami, actions are designed to be directly testable. So we can call new directly on our action, and we can even pass in a test double for this book repo dependency. And this lets us control its behavior for the purposes of this test. And that's enough for us to call the action, test its response body, and ensure that it meets our expectations. This is, of course, a low-level isolated test. For most actions, we won't want to go this far. A more useful approach might be an integrated request spec, something where we call the app from the outside and test through all of its integrated components. And this approach is also available in every new Hanami app. But because all Hanami objects are directly testable, like we can see on the screen here, it means we get to make the best choice for each testing situation. So we've interacted with our code through tests. We can also do that through a console. So we can open the console with the Hanami console command. And then when we're inside, we can use this app shortcut to refer to our app. That's the bookshelf app class that we created right at the beginning. And through this app, we can access our components. And again, they come back as instances ready for us to use. And this console always starts quickly, no matter the size of the app. And this is because Hanami provides two different kinds of boot levels. We have one called boot, and this is the traditional kind of boot that loads everything out up front. And that's the kind of approach we want to take for pre-forking web servers like Puma. But we also have one called prepare, and this is a super lightweight mode. It minimizes what it loads up front. And this is useful, and we use this in all aspects of dev. We use it in the console, when running the tests, and when running our dev server. And it keeps every aspect of the development, local development, as snappy as possible. And one of the things Hanami does during both of these boot modes is load some settings. These are the values that we give our app to make sure it runs correctly in each environment. Things like API keys and secrets and flags. And we can define our settings here. So say we wanted our app to send emails when new books are added. And to do this, we want to use a third-party email delivery API. Well, here we can add a setting for its API key, and we can specify that we want this to be a string. Hanami will then load these settings from matching environment variables. And in development, we can use .n files as well to populate them for our environments. And then we can access these loaded settings as another component in our app. And it comes with methods for each of the settings we've just defined. And then we can go on and include this as a dependency of any object thanks to our deps mixin. So aside from settings, so far we've only seen components loaded from classes in our app directory. But what about components that might need some extra special handling as part of their setup? This is where providers help. And we do need to make one right now for our email service. We've already created the setting for our API key. Now we need to use it somewhere. Providers have their own folder in config, and here we're registering a provider for our email service. And in this provider, we have a couple of lifecycle steps. To start off with, we will require the gem for this third-party service. Then we'll grab our API key from that settings component that we just used before. We'll pass it in to configure the email client, and then we'll register that client as a component in our app. This means that any class using email service as a dependency will get this fully configured client that we've set up right here. Now, by this point, we've covered nearly everything we need to know about Hanami apps. But there's one more important thing for us to discover, and that's slices. Slices help us organize our app into separate domains or technical concerns. And they're fantastic for introducing modularity and clearer internal boundaries to our app as it grows. Now, we don't see slices in a brand new Hanami app, and that's because we decided to make that first run experience as simple as possible. But they are built in, and they appear as soon as we start putting any code into our slices directory. Hanami can help us do this as well with its slice generator. So let's make an admin slice now. This will prepare an admin slice directory for us. And then we can throw a books create action into the admin slice. Then just like our app, every slice maps to a single Ruby namespace. So here we're using admin. Hanami will also create a slice class for us to use. And that slice works exactly like our app. It offers access to all the components. The only difference being is that the slice is confined to the components from its own slice directory. And then just like the app, slices also have their own depth mixin, and this comes with the same restriction. It only loads components from inside the slice. So now we've seen that both the app and slices can act as containers for our components. And then thanks to the depth mixin, we can also clearly recognize the dependencies between components and begin to think about them as a clear, directed graph. And from here, we can take things one step further because slices can import components from other slices, which means we can envision an equally clear graph of all the app's high-level concerns. This is a really powerful approach. Here we have the tools built right into a framework to help us better organize our code at every level for easier understanding and maintainability. And one thing we wanted to do with Hanami 2 was extend this power to apps of all kinds, not just web apps. Take a look at the top of the gem file in the new Hanami app. By default, this here is a web app because we include the router and controller gems. However, these are not fixed dependencies of the framework, which is why they're here in this gem file. So if we wanted to build something different to a web app, all we need to do is remove those extra lines from the gem file. And then with the single core Hanami gem we have left behind, we still have all the quality of life features that we've just looked at. Containers, components, depths, settings, the console, even slices, they're all there. So it means we get to keep everything we need and nothing we don't. And we can put all of these features to use for any kind of app. So Hanami 2 is no longer just a web framework, it's an everything framework. If we wanted to build a chatbot, a CLI tool, a Kafka consumer, a serverless function, but we still want all the conveniences of a full framework, well, now we can do it with Hanami. I don't think Ruby has ever had something quite like this, and I'm really excited to see where people take it. I'm also excited for how Hanami can help us grow as Rubyists, because it brings more to the table than just a collection of framework features. It provides a new opinion on what constitutes good app design, and then it embodies those opinions in its own design. And I think we can learn from this and turn it into growth as developers. So how can we grow? Well, firstly, we can grow our understanding of our app's domain, and Hanami encourages this in a few ways. To start with, it makes one important thing clear. The framework is not our app. They're separate things. The framework should work in service of our app, not the other way around. Hanami routes and actions are intended to work as gateways into our app, really thin ones. Our core business logic is ours, and it's supposed to be separate from those framework-provided facilities. And then if that business logic is separate, well, we do have some extra thinking to do. One of those things is to figure out how to name and organize all that code, to find that right arrangement of components and concepts to make the code the most useful expression of our business domain. And because Hanami makes it easy to decompose our logic into independent focused components, this gives us the chance to really take control over the shape of our code. So much of this work is about growing our modularity muscle, about boiling things down into those small focused components, and then composing them together to create high-level behavior that we want to offer our users. This really boils down to figuring out boundaries. And let's be honest, figuring out boundaries is important in every aspect of our lives, but it's also something we have to practice our whole lives as developers as well. So we do ourselves a big favor by working with a framework that acknowledges that this is an important activity and provides the tools to reason about it, like Hanami does with its depths and slices. And lastly, I think this is a huge opportunity for us to grow our Ruby. For starters, the core premise of the framework not being our app means that so much more of our app can be written in plain old Ruby, and that's glorious. And by building confidence with plain Ruby, it'll do wonders for our ability to think can problem solve fluently in this language. And we might even begin to see Ruby through a new lens. What we may discover is that when we create objects with injected dependencies, and then one or more methods that accept arguments and return a value, but otherwise don't change the internal state of the object, well, that begins to look a little bit like functional programming, and that can bring a lot of clarity to our code. And picking up Hanami can help us experience a whole new part of the Ruby ecosystem, because it builds on and around a rich heritage of gems for Ruby apps of all flavors. And we might find inspiration for our own code from how those gems solve their problems. And now that we're writing so much more plain old Ruby and feeling comfortable there, we might find ourselves ready to contribute back to the ecosystem with our own gems too. So we have many chances to grow. And since we started with the title, New Framework, New You, let's get back to that. We've just looked at a whole lot of new things that might feel overwhelming. So to wrap up, I want to reassure you a little with a little story. I know the New Framework, New You idea is possible because I lived it myself. And for me, it started 7 years ago. And at that time, I'd already been writing Ruby for 13 years. That's a long time. But even after all that time, I still wasn't feeling happy with how my apps were turning out. I knew I wanted to try some different approaches, but I didn't know how it should look. So I started looking around and I found two things. The first thing was the ROM gem. This is a database toolkit, and we'll be integrating that with Hanami really soon in the next couple of months. And the second thing was a gem called Rota, and that's a flexible routing toolkit. And from these gems and their ideas and the people and community around them, well, it opened up a whole new world to me. And then one thing led to another. I tried the gems, I put them in my apps, and then my apps started to change shape a little bit as I better understood the ideas of those gems. And now here I am helping to build new gems to make these ideas even more accessible than ever. Honestly, it's been the most fulfilling 7 years of my Ruby life. And I think no matter where you are on your personal journey with Ruby, I think there is always the chance for you to start to take things in a new direction. So with this in mind, I have a few parting tips to help us all with our New Year's resolution. Firstly, be curious. There is lots out there to learn. Maybe Hanami can be your gateway into something new. Be bold. If you find something interesting, give it a try. And if that thing feels unnatural or uncomfortable for a while, take that as a good sign. It means you're learning something. Be excited. I know I am. I hope that's come across. I think we're at the beginning of a special moment for Ruby, a resurgence of new ideas. And this is your chance to be a part of it. And lastly, be persistent. You can always try and try again. And since we started with the idea of this being a New Year's resolution, I think we can take inspiration from the New Year's calendar in Nepal, and that you can always have a second or third or fourth New Year's to give things yet another go. If any of this is interesting to you and you want to learn more, go check out the Hanami site. When we released 2.0, we released a new version of our Getting Started guide to help you understand the ins and outs of the framework. I'm also slowly developing an open source example app using Hanami 2. That's Decaf Sucks on GitHub. It is open source and I'm developing it 1 PR at a time. So if you want to watch the repo on GitHub, this is your chance to follow along and see all the pieces come together. And lastly, I'd love to chat more. I'm on the Fediverse, I'm on Mastodon. Say hi at ruby.social. Sign up if you haven't yet. It's a great community forming there. I'm also happy to take questions now if that's how you do things. But otherwise, love to chat on the internet anytime in the future. But yeah, thank you very much for having me.